You think about someone talking about, oh, that show was really meta, or, that's so meta, whatever. That's a move that's become very familiar to folks. But it was kind of interesting because no one necessarily picked up on that aspect in any of the existing metamodern frameworks. And using that as sort of a touchstone, I think it helps people get a sense of, oh, okay, there's this kind of recursive, remove going on and then reflecting on things.
To me, this is a great way to sort of start. So we're going to basically be recursively self-aware. All right. So, and then that plays a very nice role in the evolution of sort of traditional thinking to scientific thinking, trying to get aware in a particular sort of way, and then aware of that critique, and then aware of us as justifying in a particular way. Mm-hmm. And then, to me, what you're doing is you're explicitly now labeling this dimension, and we're becoming aware of this sort of like imaginary dimension. We're going to place ourselves in it. We'll see this all the way to its, but actually it's going to loop back around and not cause us to go insane, but it's going to be contained, and it's going to be a crucial part of the equation.
One of the arguments that I try to make, right, is that like carrying reflection further doesn't necessarily just lead to infinite reflection. It leads to the ability to reflect on maybe there's not a need for reflecting at so many levels at the moment, right? And being able to sort of toggle it appropriately through the different levels of reflection. So it's an interesting kind of theoretical question of like, well, won't this just go on infinitely or what have you? And culture, to some degree, I think it's an interesting idea. Like as culture continues to unfold, yes, of course we are going to get a reflection on metamodernism, et cetera, and then kind of keep going in that sense. But I think you're capturing something important, which is that once you name this dynamic, it doesn't lead you into this infinite hall of mirrors. It can actually then begin to explain some of the kind of simplicity and the kind of non-reflective stances that we see intentionally, enacted in metamodern art, for example, and stuff. Postmodernism itself is a very broad term, right? So you can talk about postmodern architecture, but you could also talk about postmodern theory and postmodern philosophy and all those sorts of things, right? So metamodernism is a similar category, but there's certainly a thing called postmodern art, and it has a kind of rubric and certain kind of characteristics that people have over the years identified. Cynical, kind of self-referential, very ironic, et cetera, et cetera. And there had been a heyday of that stuff for a while, especially kind of peaking in the 90s, early 90s, and then we started seeing different things that didn't really match that anymore. And people were like, well, what do we call this? So one of the earliest ways that this shows up on the scene is people just trying to give a name to the new characteristics of art that are showing up, and trying to make sense of it. And there are some kind of different attempts to formulate some ideas about what comes after postmodernism, at least as kind of an artistic period. And that's where metamodernism really shows up and gets going in earnest, is in 2010 with this paper by these two Dutch cultural theorists named Tim Vermeulen and Ruben van Daniker. And they do this thing called Notes on Metamodernism, and they seem to kind of hit on something that really worked in a way that some of the other formulations of postmodernism didn't. And so they saw this dynamic of this new kind of art seemed to be moving back and forth between some of that postmodern cynicism and irony, and then into this other kind of more typically modern kind of sincerity and kind of enthusiasm and utopianism. And so they kind of they recognized this characteristic, and they refer to this dynamic as an oscillation back and forth. And it really jump-started this whole new way of then being able to analyze art. Though it's not purely limited to art either. I mean, the cultural studies folks, they would try to make the case that you see metamodern shifts happening all over the place in culture, including politics, including various kinds of new economic and institutional things as well. So
now, did they coin the term sincere irony? Were those folks?
They coined a couple of these characteristics: sincere irony, pragmatic idealism, informed naivete as sort of some of the chief. And they work really well. I mean, it's great. It's a very helpful rubric to look at things and be able to be like, oh yeah, like this is this metamodern sensibility that's very different from that older postmodern thing. So, then it's just a question at that point of like, is that all this is? And I'm inclined to say, well, maybe art's just the tip of the iceberg. Maybe this is much deeper cultural structural roots. And then that's where you start getting into the theory about what we're really talking about and what is all this stuff.
Recursive relevance realization often can be framed as a dialectic between balancing order and chaos in the right criticality. Brett Anderson was on, and there's some series you were on, which right after you. His whole presentation basically is our core architecture of consciousness is about finding the criticality between order and chaos. You could certainly look at the postmodern critique as to deconstruct and chaotically reduce the order, the excessive order and the imbalanced power order of modernity. And then as that gains dominance, you're like, okay, there isn't enough structure, order, and so then the swing back and so yes, more than at just a justificatory level, although I think there's dynamics there. Just at the agent arena relation, you can argue this criticality, chaos, order, to find then the complex adaptive sweet spot.
Like you have a conversation and it's dynamic and you hear an idea and you've never heard it before and you're like, oh wow, like this has a lot of repercussions. We have to really grapple with this, deal with it, etc. And like that's great, right? And it can be critical. It can be like an undermining of something. You're like, oh wow, this changes everything. But then you have a number of those conversations and you have them in different places and across different domains, and the same basic point starts being made over and over and over again. And eventually it doesn't have the aha feeling anymore. It's like, yeah, we get that. And and it's going on over here and it's going on over here. And what you do is you like see the structure of it. You're like, it's an object of thought now, instead of like a, whoa, interesting. It's like we have a term for that now. We know what that is. And that's, what everyone's talking about. And yes, so then you've moved from this moment of sort of reflection into like reification or making it something an object of thought. And so a lot of these postmodern critiques were coming in and they initially landed as like, wow, interesting. Ooh, this, but eventually it's sort of like, oh yeah, that's a postmodern critique and blah, blah, blah. And like, okay, and now what? You know what I mean? So there's this natural process that moves through that is kind of part of how we, reflect on new information and try to update our justification systems, et cetera. And yeah, as you say, like eventually then that's going to lead to a kind of recalibration or a kind of, an attempt to then fold that in a meaningful way that can then be adaptive. I call it a worldview because I think it is a very comprehensive, way of orienting your thought.